Thanksgiving is the holiday for giving thanks, but it's also the holiday for food. Many of us look forward to stuffing ourselves on Turkey Day. And so I think it's really important for us to kind of take a step back and remember that while it's fun to take a day off from our regular diet, which hopefully is a little bit more balanced and healthy, it's really important still to be mindful of not going overboard. So we're going to dive into things like why we overeat, why it's harmful to our health, and ways to enjoy the holiday fun without some of the risks to your health. I'm Dr. Neha Bartuk, and you're listening to Health Discovered, a podcast by WebMD. So we've all heard the term comfort food, and Thanksgiving definitely supplies a lot of it, and also a lot of social connection. We are meeting with family and friends and eating lots and lots of different kinds of foods like turkey, mashed potatoes, casseroles, and in our house, lots and lots of mac and cheese. So for sure, this is a time that we look forward to. And it's also a time that we're kind of more stressed than usual. So we may be turning more towards these foods to just calm us down a little bit, especially during Thanksgiving and then the coming holidays. During these times, we often forget to keep moderation in mind. The good news is that there are lots of ways to enjoy all of these comfort foods in a way that is still mindful and can help us avoid uncomfortable consequences like heartburn, indigestion, and other GI symptoms. So today I am super excited to talk to Jaydeep Bhat, my husband, who happens to be a gastroenterologist, about ways to maintain your own health and your family's health over the holidays.
I really want to give a thank you to you, Jaydeep, my husband, for being here, talking about the lead up into Thanksgiving. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it's like for our family of 2 doctors, but specifically what it's like for you as a gastroenterologist that may have some Thanksgiving, maybe holiday-specific reasons sometimes that you get called into the hospital. So thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be on your podcast. I think I've been lobbying to be on the podcast for a long time. Thank you No, I'm just kidding. But, it is a little anticlimactic because you mentioned having me on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and I was envisioning coming to the Midtown office in Atlanta and having, being set up in this nice studio, recording with these nice plush chairs, and we're essentially in our basement recording.
Hey, there's a very nice setup for you. You have a mic and everything.
It's nice. There's a mic. It's a little mini recording studio. So thank you. No, it's an honor. I've been listening to the podcast and very proud of you for you and your staff to getting it set up. And, it's some really informative topics the last couple of months. And I hope I can add to the conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, our team, we have a pretty awesome team for sure. I know it's a very stressful time of year, but we do look forward to it, right? We kind of anticipate a lot of joy and family time as we're leading into the Thanksgiving holidays, which basically means the holiday season and the end of the year. But I have to say, whenever you're on call, I get a lot more stressed out than usual. And sometimes I feel like when you're on call during Thanksgiving and maybe some of the winter holidays, Christmas, New Year's, you get called into the hospital more than when you're on call at other times during the year. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, luckily I'm not on call this week for Thanksgiving. I have been in the past. It's been a couple of years. I think the frequency of getting called in on during the holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, it's probably the same frequency. I think we remember the times we've been called in. They stick out in our minds because they're during busy times or times where we want to be spending with our family. And that just kind of sticks out in our mind. But I think overall, I haven't really read any data on increased calls or increased, frequency of going in hospitals to do procedures or surgeries during holiday weekends. Might be there, but I think it's about the same.
Okay. All right. So maybe it's just something that sticks out in my mind. So thank you for always correcting me when I'm wrong. And I know this may be the first time that I've said it with a thank you.
Well, yeah, I think we always tend to remember, the bad things, right? So not necessarily bad, but we remember those stick out in our minds. Like, so that there have been times where I have gone in during Thanksgiving or been called very frequently during Thanksgiving or Christmas Eve, and those stick out in our minds. That's what we tend to remember.
Okay. That's a very good point. Point well taken. So from a GI perspective, so I'm primary care, and just to sort of clarify a little around what it means to be on call or not, it's essentially your call weeks are weeks where you are basically the hospital can call on you as a gastroenterologist if there's some sort of emergency, some sort of need for a patient. And clearly we take that very seriously in our family, that really does come first because it is a privilege to care for people. And so when needed, that is the biggest and most important responsibility. So I think that we both agree that that's something that we both think is very important.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, definitely, these are people that are also wanting to spend time with their families. They have an acute illness that needs treatment. Obviously, it's difficult leaving your family, or especially during a holiday time. But, we have to remember that, it is, we're in a kind of a privileged position to care for these patients. And, sometimes they need immediate care. You can't wait, and you need to be there for them.
So as a gastroenterologist, what are some of the things that you'd like to highlight as things you get called into the hospital for on an emergency basis?
Right. I mean, it's a lot of times it's bleeding, GI bleeding. So, upper GI bleeding, either bleeding from a stomach ulcer or a small intestinal ulcer. That's pretty frequent. Usually, unless they're very unstable, you don't have to necessarily go in that night, but they usually need an endoscopy or endoscopic procedure within 24 hours. So usually it can wait till the next morning, and you can kind of address it then. There's other types of bleeding, not just ulcerative bleeding. There's something called variceal bleeding. So esophageal varices are something that most typically happen with cirrhosis or portal hypertension. You can get dilated veins in the esophagus that can tend to bleed. That is something that's pretty emergent. Sometimes you can hold off to the next morning, but often you have to go in and stop the bleeding once they're stabilized. So usually overnight, but that does involve going in and kind of stopping the bleeding. The other big thing that's very typical, often requires an endoscopy, in the middle of the night, is a food impaction. So that's when, food or a foreign object, usually food, most of the time in adults it's food, gets stuck in the esophagus, either due to a narrowing in the esophagus. It could be due to certain conditions like eosinophilic esophagitis. But some people are more prone to developing these narrowings where food can get trapped. And, that often needs to come out pretty soon after.
Okay. Yeah. And can you help us envision, what does it mean when you say an endoscopy? So for example, something like a food impaction, I think a lot of us envision that food is stuck in the esophagus, the tunnel where, between your mouth and your stomach. And maybe it's just a little push or a little nudge that just pushes it into the stomach and you're all good. Or you pull it out, and bring it back out through the mouth. But talk to me a little bit about that. I know that our kids have heard many stories about this process and this procedure. So share it with us.
So usually you want to get these pieces of food out within 24 hours, or else there can be, complications. You could form ulcers, inflammation, and it can lead to sometimes a perforation or a tear within the esophagus if you leave it in for a long period of time. So usually you want to get that piece of food out within 24 hours. Now, there's times when it's very emergent. You want to get the food out within 2 to 6 hours. So those are people that can't control their secretions. So they're constantly vomiting. They can't even handle the saliva from their mouth. They're drooling. They're having difficulty, a lot of discomfort. Those are people that you don't want to wait till the next morning. You want to go in the middle of the night. So that's something that, I've gone in very frequently for. So what it involves is usually, first of all, putting the patient to sleep. And usually with an endoscopic procedure, I think a lot of your listeners have probably had, colonoscopies or upper endoscopies. It usually involves just moderate sedation or deep sedation with propofol. So you're breathing on your own. It's not general anesthesia. With a food impaction, you definitely do want to do general anesthesia. So you want to intubate them. So you want to, put them on a breathing machine. The reason we do that is not necessarily because of respiratory distress, but you want to protect their airway. Mm-hmm. So when you're taking food out of the esophagus and you're maybe going in and out a couple of times, some of that food may drop into the windpipe or the trachea while you're doing that. So you want to protect the airway and keep it secure. So you want to do these procedures under general anesthesia. And after you do that, we use a fiber optic camera with a light source, and it's hooked up to a monitor, and we insert that into someone's mouth, and we go down the mouth into the esophagus. And usually with a typical upper endoscopy, we evaluate the stomach and the first part of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum. In a food impaction, we're really dealing mainly with the esophagus because food is kind of obstructing the esophagus, right? And yeah, I can go into it a little bit more in detail. I don't want to be too long-winded, but basically use that camera, and we can insert tools down that camera to help either push the food into the stomach, or more often, what we have to do is actually pull the food out of the esophagus through the mouth. And we have different tools to help do that.
Who's most at risk for having food stuck? And when it gets stuck, is it usually right at the upper part of the esophagus? Or is it like, sometimes people feel like, I ate a big piece of something and it's gone down and it just kind of feels stuck in the middle of my chest. Where is food most likely to get stuck, and who's at highest risk for the food to get stuck?
Yeah, it's a lot of times it's elderly patients, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is just simple poor dentition. A lot of elderly patients don't have very good dentition.
Meaning their teeth are not.
Correct.
Okay.
So they're maybe not chewing, particularly bulky. And the things that typically I see getting impacted are bulky pieces of food. So meats, like a steak, a piece of chicken, sometimes even like bulky pieces of bread. So those are things that elderly people with poor dentition may not be able to chew very thoroughly. So that just physical, bulk of food going down, even a normal esophagus, can cause an obstruction. During the holidays, people are eating turkey, people are eating, ham. They're sometimes eating while they're talking. That all leads to maybe just not chewing your food up very well, and kind of crushing it up enough for it to easily slide down the esophagus. The other thing is, elderly people sometimes develop rings or narrowings, strictures. And it's usually, you see that usually in the distal esophagus. So that's the part of the esophagus that's meeting the stomach. So that's usually where you see these narrowings, these strictures, and that's usually where the food tends to collect.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. So any of us can really, so we always say that digestion begins in your mouth, right? So we try to tell the kids, slow down when they're chewing and eating. And so that's really an important thing to be mindful of and to be thinking about as you're eating your holiday dinner, maybe eating more than you normally would. And you're kind of, we're finally back to really connecting with each other, maybe big parties. So really thinking about that first process of digestion where putting the food in your mouth, really making sure that you're chewing it properly so that you can digest it. And then clearly there are some people that are just at higher risk for this happening.
Right. Another population is you see more and more this diagnosis, I mentioned it before, something called eosinophilic esophagitis. So that's actually an autoimmune condition. It's usually related to people and associated with people that have other atopic diseases. So things like asthma or eczema.
So other diseases that are like allergy-related diseases.
Yes. Yeah. Eosinophils are kind of the immune cell that mediates allergic kind of diseases. So that basically, just in layman's terms, that these eosinophils can build up in the esophagus and cause this kind of microscopic inflammation that can lead to narrowings, strictures, and it's usually young people where you see this in. So it's kind of two populations. You see these elderly patients with food impactions, but then I've also scoped many 32-year-old males. And often the history is, I've had trouble swallowing for many, many years. And then it'll get to a point where they may develop a stricture and then they have this full-on food impaction that needs to be emergently taken care of.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting that there's this like sort of bimodal age distribution. That's really interesting. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some other holiday-related things. I mean, particularly, I think what we're trying to do in our family, so we have more and more each year to give thanks for, with that additional child that has come along. So now we've got 3. And definitely during the holidays, they're looking forward to us making a lot of different types of food. Maybe food that we're not cooking a lot during the year. When it comes to me, I know they're looking forward to me just cooking, period, because that's not necessarily something I do much of during the year. So we have a lot. We have a lot at our table. So what do you think about in terms of how we kind of talk about in our house, just like making sure that we're eating mindfully, we're not overeating, we're not necessarily overindulging, but we're still enjoying these treats?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to, doing things mindfully, like you said, like just like you want to do anything in your life. I mean, that we strive to do that, but you want to do it with kind of full attention, and that's something that I actually was brought up with, that comes from my parents and their parents. And as you know, my family's very into food. And oftentimes, I remember my mom, this isn't just holiday meals, but just any meal, just, okay, no one's talking, no one's doing anything. We're just eating and enjoying our food and appreciating it. And I think what that does, number one, is you really start having gratitude for the food that you're given and the food that you're eating. And then you really truly start appreciating all the flavors, particularly, we grew up with Indian food, so many different spices and flavors, and you really get to truly appreciate all the elements that are, kind of in this meal that's been cooked for you. So it allows you to be more appreciative, and it allows you to, maybe pick up on physical cues that, hey, now I'm full, I'm starting to get full. It's something that you tend not to get if you're talking or if you're working. I see so many people working, during meal and just inhaling food. You really have you don't have as much consciousness of what you're putting in your body and your physical cues and just appreciation of food when you're doing that. So I, even on a daily basis for lunch, I try to take at least 15 minutes where I'm just eating and doing nothing else.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think I grew up in a very different way, which was very boisterous. Meal times were times where we're having like really intense conversations and just arguments and discussions. And I do know that we're like scarfing down our food. And that's definitely something you're trying to instill in the children and us as a family, of just being grateful. And it is hard, I think, when you spend all this time cooking. Can you imagine the person spending all this time cooking the meal? Everybody sits down. They're not acknowledging it. They're not enjoying the flavors. They're just scarfing it down. It's gone. And like something that you took so much time making is just gone.
Yeah, I know my mom has had that feeling. So maybe it was her just trying to cue us to say, hey, I like your food. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mom. Yeah. I like your food.
Yeah. But I think there's a balance. I mean, holidays and even just regular dinners are oftentimes where, it's the only time in the day where families are coming together. So you do want to have conversation. You want to catch up with your kids. You want to see what's going on. But, there's got to be, just like in anything, you got to be a little bit of a balance, I think.
Yeah, no, it's true. And this kind of comes into my zone as the primary care doc, of just kind of thinking about why we may indulge in these kinds of behaviors, particularly around the holidays, where you're kind of, everything has been leading up to this meal, and you are stressed, and you are probably have skipped your other meals going into this meal. And so you're just ready to eat, and you're just hungry. And that's one of the big things that can lead to overeating. And particularly during the holidays, you are going to have a lot more of those foods, of those dishes that are probably higher in fat. And, we love our mac and cheese at our table. I can think of probably most of the dishes were vegetarian, but still that doesn't mean we're healthy vegetarian most of the time, and definitely not during the holidays. But eating a lot of high-fat foods, all of that can just sort of like stunt your, like you said, your own internal response to your cues that you're actually full. Your stomach does not want any more. And then we also have this idea of clearing your plate, like you've got to just clean that plate, and that overrides maybe that feeling of satiety, or that feeling that like I'm done. And I've noticed that in our kids, like especially as they get older, maybe they feel more of that social pressure to finish their dishes. But the 2-year-old, she may be scarfing things down, but when she's done, she will spit it out. Mm-hmm. Right? She will spit it out and be like, no, I'm not eating the rest of this. Yeah. So I'm just wondering what we can learn there from our...
Well, I think it's just portion. I think sometimes, we as parents maybe just overportion kids. We're used to adult portions, and kids have certainly different portions. So I think it's important to teach them to maybe finish their plate and not waste food, and be mindful of that. But then maybe it's our responsibility to portion them appropriately. But and if they are truly full, then not forcing them. I think that's something that was definitely imparted on me, and maybe leads to overeating sometimes.
Yeah, sure, for sure. And then I think definitely sort of, again, coming back to the primary care piece of it, sort of the stress management piece, where you're just kind of, there's just so much going on in the world, maybe at your own dinner table with family dynamics, where it's just sort of like, this food is going to calm me down a little bit. So I just loved what you said about the mindful eating and just how you grew up. We've got to talk about that more, because that is really critical in terms of just sitting down and savoring things and having gratitude. And that's really what this season is about, really, is just really kind of focusing on the things you're grateful for. So I think I would love to talk to you more about that and see how we can kind of incorporate more of those ideas into our own sort of Thanksgiving traditions. But I'm curious from a GI perspective, what are some of the things that overeating can do health-wise that you see in the clinic or with your patients when someone has overindulged or...
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I think overeating is usually a result of what you're saying. They're kind of manifesting a certain emotion they may be feeling, loneliness or stress or anger. And, they're not overeating because, they're just, have that much capacity for food. They're usually manifesting certain emotions. So I think that's something you have to be conscious of. But yeah, it can lead to obviously a lot of physical manifestations. Chronic overeating obviously leads to obesity, being overweight, which there's all cascade of downstream things that can cause. But just in the short term, yeah, acid reflux, nausea, a feeling of bloating, feeling of indigestion or dyspepsia. We talk about. It's not just the types of foods you eat, greasy, spicy, acidic, those kind of things, but it's also the amount of food you're eating, the timing of it, So I usually tell my patients, try to have about 3 hours between your last meal of the day and bedtime. And actually the time you actually lay down for bed. So if you go to bed at 11, but you lay down for bed and watch some TV at 10, then you really shouldn't eat after 7. And that last meal of the day should be your smallest meal of the day. So yeah, there are definitely some short-term and long-term manifestations of overeating.
Yeah. I know it's interesting. I think, again, that kind of comes back to this whole idea of eating mindfully. Maybe you'll eat more during the course of the day. Maybe it'll be a little bit smaller portions so that you are able to digest that in an appropriate way and be able to sort of handle that next meal without the heartburn, the indigestion, the acid reflux potentially. And then also just paying attention to the foods that personally affect you in that way, right? So I think the two of us have very different types of foods that make us feel heartburn and indigestion when we have that. You are a man who loves his spice. I am a woman who cannot tolerate it. So I'm still shocked by the number of different spice seasonings, or what do you call it, hot sauces that you have in our cabinet. Do you have a number? Do you know how many we have?
It's a lot. It's a lot. It's definitely in the double digits. Yeah.
I never knew till I met you that there were so many different forms and so many different types of hot sauces. But yeah, so each of us has there's certain groups of food that are more common in everyone to cause heartburn, but it can also be individual. I know for me, bananas do it. I don't know why, but they really make me have a lot of reflux.
Yeah. So everyone's individual. I usually give people like kind of the general, groups of foods that tend to cause it. The most obvious are like greasy, fried, processed foods, spicy foods. So the most obvious. There's probably 5 or 6 other like pretty general things that affect mostly everyone. But then everyone has their own specific foods that trigger them. So what I tell people to do for not just for acid reflux, for many food-related GI disorders, I tell them to do a food diary. Buy a little journal or diary from drugstore, and over the next 4 weeks, write down kind of what you're eating and write down your symptoms throughout the day. And that kind of prospective documenting can help you find, some of your own personal food triggers. Because when you're trying to retrospectively remember what caused your acid reflux, it's very difficult. But when you're actually documenting it in real time, you can figure out those patterns.
Wow. I know we don't have much time until Thanksgiving, and we've got this year for sure. I think we were more mindful about even planning time to be with the family without other things intruding. So I am thankful for that, for sure. Anything that you want to closing thoughts, things you wish I had asked you, things you were dying to say to me that you'd like to share?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the podcast. I think this is what 20. We've been going 29 minutes, no interruptions. That's pretty amazing. I think that's a record. Maybe we should do podcasts more often. We can just plan our week via podcast.
That's right. That's the only way we
Because it's
can.
like absolutely silent. I have no idea what the kids are doing, but they're silent, and we've had a 29-minute conversation with no interruptions. That's pretty amazing. So.
Wow, how mindful of you to recognize that. You're absolutely right. And mind you, all three are at home and somewhere in this house and doing something. And we haven't heard from them. So you're right.
They're awesome.
Yeah. Thank you so much for talking us through the experience of a GI doc around the holiday time and as a doctor family around the holiday time. It's been really interesting to talk to you. It's a couple of things that I hadn't thought about and realize now why you like it to be really quiet around dinner time. So thank you. I've learned something new today.
This has just been such a fun episode. I'm so thankful to Jaydeep for joining me and teaching me a lot of things about him that I didn't know. From our family to yours, we wish you a very happy Thanksgiving and a joyful rest of 2022. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Health Discovered, a podcast by WebMD. I'm Dr. Neha Bhatak, Chief Physician Editor of Health and Lifestyle Medicine, and I want you to enjoy your holiday while keeping your health in mind. We'll see you next time. Happy Thanksgiving.